Yes, my name is Sandeep Khosla. I'm an endocrinologist in the Department of Medicine here at Mayo. Well, over the past 15 years or so, we've seen a growing number of drugs that are now available to prevent and to treat osteoporosis. The principal ones of these are the bisphosphonates, which include alendronate, brasidronate, abandronate, and zoledronic acid. Off these, there are two or three of them are oral medications, and then two can be given intravenously. In addition to the bisphosphonates, also approved by the FDA for osteoporosis is a selective estrogen receptor modulator, or raloxifene. Estrogen is also approved for this purpose, as is calcitonin. So you can see there are a number of drugs that are kind of similar in that they all work by preventing the breakdown of bone. In addition to these, there's one drug that stimulates bone formation, teriparatide, which is also FDA approved. So there's a number of these drugs that are now available, which, as I mentioned, have become available over the past 15 years or so. And it's this market that Denosmab will be entering. Yes, well, I think the existing drugs are all effective, and they do reduce fracture risk substantially. The Denosmab is in the class of drugs that prevent the breakdown of bone, or anti-resorptive drugs. And most of the drugs that we have, with the exception of teriparatide, actually all of them with the exception of teriparatide, are in this class of anti-resorptive drugs. So the precise niche for Denosmab, I think, is still going to be kind of an evolution as we see what happens with it after it's approved by the FDA. Certainly, there are going to be patients that can't tolerate the oral medications because of stomach problems or esophageal ulcers. Now, some of those, of course, can be switched to the intravenous bisphosphonates. But again, some patients don't tolerate those because of side effects from the infusions, such as fever and arthralgias that some patients get. Also, to get the infusion, you have to go into a physician's office, whereas Denosmab can be given subcutaneously, so potentially it can be self-administered by the patient. In addition, the bisphosphonates in particular are contraindicated in patients with renal insufficiency. And this is probably not going to be the case for Denosmab, since it's not cleared by the kidney. So there are going to be specific subgroups of patients where I think Denosmab would be a very useful alternative. But whether it can displace all of the other drugs that are already out there and that are also quite effective, I think is probably doubtful. Yeah, I think with ONJ, it depends on the patient population that you're talking about. ONJ has primarily been described in patients with malignancy who've been given high doses of intravenous bisphosphonates, such as zoledronic acid 5 milligrams every 4 to 6 weeks in those patients, for example, with multiple myeloma or metastatic breast cancer, in contrast to the patient with osteoporosis who's going to receive 5 milligrams once a year. So the incidence of ONJ in patients receiving those very high doses is significant. It could be anywhere between 1 to 10% per year. But in the patient receiving oral bisphosphonates or those receiving zoledronic acid at doses of 5 milligrams a year, the incidence is probably very, very low. We don't know exactly how low, but the best estimate I would have is it's probably somewhere in the range of 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 100,000 cases. It's been reported, and particularly with the intravenous bisphosphonate zoledronic acid, it's something to keep in mind, and particularly in a patient who's got pre-existing arrhythmias. But in my experience, and certainly in the experience of most physicians treating patients with osteoporosis, it really hasn't been a significant problem. It certainly wasn't found in the studies that have been done so far with the roughly 8,000 patients in the Cummings trial and about 1,500 or so in the Smith study. I think that's a question whether the osteonecrosis of the jaw or the subtrochanteric fractures that have been reported with bisphosphonates are unique to bisphosphonates, or are those actually present in with other drugs that also inhibit bone resorption. So I think that question is unresolved, but certainly it's reassuring that of the patients that have been treated with denosmab, there haven't been any cases that I'm aware of to date of these complications. So that's been a concern all along since the discovery of rank ligand, because rank ligand is expressed not just on osteoblastic cells, but also in a number of immune cells. And its precise role in immune function is still somewhat unclear. I think overall, again, it's reassuring in the papers published in the New England Journal that there weren't any overt immune system abnormalities found in the patients. There was some increase in the incidence of eczema, and if you happen to develop cellulitis, you were more likely to get hospitalized with it. And I think those are things to keep in mind, and in my mind shouldn't deter from the further development of this drug or the progression of this drug to clinical use. However, I think it does behoove us to closely monitor patients, particularly in the community, once they start taking this medicine, especially as you start to use it in patients that potentially aren't as healthy as the patients that were involved in the clinical trials. That's a difficult question to answer, but if I were to sort of speculate, I would think that this would be the kind of drug that, once a person has sort of gone past the standard treatments, which would be oral bisphosphonates, that the question of IV bisphosphonates or denosmab, particularly given the higher costs of these drugs, would probably be best handled by a specialist in the osteoporosis area. Well, the oncology patients have been, bisphosphonates have been used in those patients for a number of years, particularly those with skeletal metastases, as a way to reduce pathologic fractures and other skeletal problems in those patients. And by targeting the osteoclast, as bisphosphonates and denosmab do, it appears that you can reduce skeletal complications in those patients. So certainly as more studies become available, I suspect that denosmab will be a useful drug in those patients also, just as bisphosphonates are. It's important to note that in the prostate cancer paper that was published by Smith and colleagues, their denosmab was not being used specifically for skeletal metastases. It was being used to prevent bone loss due to hypogonadism, very similar to preventing postmenopausal osteoporosis. So it was a different indication there than might be used in patients with myeloma and breast cancer. I mentioned in my editorial, I guess the only other point I might make is that there's only one formation-stimulating drug, or teriparatide, currently on the market. And I guess looking down the future, Amgen has a very similar antibody against a protein called SOST, or SOST. And that, in preclinical studies, appears to be very effective in increasing bone mass. So I suspect 5 to 7 years ago, 5 to 7 years from now, assuming that medication progresses as one would predict, we'll be having this discussion about a potentially novel anabolic treatment. And I think that's where there's a real need in osteoporosis, is to restore bone mass rather than just preventing bone loss.